If I were to suggest to you that the most significant restriction in your existence is not a lack of capital, nor a shortage of openings, nor even the adversary himself, but rather the mental portraits you harbor within your subconscious, would you find that believable? Because the vast majority of individuals petition through prayer for a transformation, yet they persist in mentally rehearsing failure. They petition for restoration, yet they visualize their own passing. They petition for abundance, yet they constantly perceive themselves in a state of owing. And then they query, why does the divine not provide an answer? Perhaps the more accurate inquiry should be different. What dialect are you employing to converse with the Holy Spirit? Today I am going to reveal to you the vocabularies and the perceptions of the fourth dimension, the dialect that constructs realities, reshapes destinies, and alters lives from the interior to the exterior. And if you grasp this concept, you will never again contemplate, petition, or speak in that same manner. For a great many years, I held the conviction that belief was merely something occurring within the heart, something imperceptible, hushed, almost theoretical. I petitioned, I proclaimed, I scrutinized the scriptures extensively, but there were instances where, even while performing every action correctly, the outcomes simply did not materialize. It was then that I began to recognize something both unsettling and liberating. The Creator had already provided answers to many of my petitions, but I was not equipped to accept the responses because my intellect was still shackled to the third dimension. We, as human entities, exist restricted by the physical frame, by time, by space, and by external factors. We rise feeling exhausted. We inspect the bank statement. We observe unfavorable reports. We manage household frictions, ailments, and chronic setbacks. And without realizing it, these portraits begin to rule our inner self. When we lower our eyelids, we do not perceive what we yearn to experience. We perceive what we dread losing. And this is exceptionally perilous. I ascertained that the capacity for mental imagery is not a plaything of the intellect. It is a spiritual apparatus. It is the site where the fourth dimension commences its operation. The Holy Spirit does not function within dread, within apprehension, or within hopelessness. He collaborates with perceptions, aspirations, and distinct mental portraits. This is why the divine has always communicated through perceptions. This is why the scriptures are populated with aspirations. This is why he never merely said believe, but rather instructed to behold. Perhaps you were instructed, as many have been, to be wary of mental imagery. They claim that imagining is hazardous, that it is a product of a human intellect, and that it can lead to deception. But tell me one thing, in all candor. How many times have you already visualized the worst outcome occurring? How many times have you rehearsed a catastrophe within your mind before it even took place? How many nights have you forfeited rest because your intellect insisted on constructing scenarios of collapse, desertion, or deprivation? You did not cease to use imagery. You simply began to use it against yourself. I observed this vividly when I initiated my calling. My congregation was small, the assets were scarce, and everyone in my proximity urged me to be grounded in reality. But being grounded in that setting meant accepting the restriction as an ultimate fate. I petitioned for expansion, but when I lowered my eyelids, I still perceived unoccupied chairs. I requested for lives to be renewed, but I still perceived myself as a fragile, restricted, and weary leader. My speech articulated belief, but my internal portraits articulated dread. It was then that I grasped something that shifted everything. It is insufficient to petition with the mouth if the intellect continues to broadcast a conflicting message. The fourth dimension reacts to what is incubated within the subconscious. That which you perceive repeatedly inside yourself begins to take shape, begins to establish roots, and begins to exert authority. The scriptures state that the Holy Spirit collaborates with us. This implies that there is a partnership. The divine does not infringe upon the human intellect. He functions through it. When you fail to provide a perception, when you do not construct a portrait, when you do not dream, You are leaving an unoccupied void, and that void never remains unoccupied for a long duration. Dread inhabits it. Uncertainty inhabits it. Afflicted recollections inhabit it. And so people remark, "Leader, I petition, but nothing shifts." But I inquire, what do you behold when you petition? Do you behold restoration, or do you behold the infirmary cot? Do you behold harmony, or do you behold the most recent dispute? Do you behold provision, or do you behold the accumulated liabilities? Because the reality is severe, yet liberating. The human intellect always complies with the most potent portrait. Contemporary investigations validate something the scriptures already taught thousands of years ago. The brain does not distinguish clearly between what is factual and what is intensely visualized. Sentiments, biochemical signals, and choices are swayed by recurring mental portraits. Individuals who exist visualizing defeat generate internal reactions of persistent tension. Individuals who learn to visualize hope, intent, and guidance develop greater emotional durability, transparency, and even an enhancement in physical health. This is not inexpensive mysticism. This is spiritual regulation functioning in harmony with human creation. When I began to shift my internal portraits, something shifted within me first. Before the congregation shifted, the leader shifted. Before the outcomes shifted, the perception shifted. I began to behold a vibrant congregation, to behold individuals being mended, to behold expansion before expansion existed, not through delusion, but through synchronization with the fourth dimension. And let me mention something that might challenge you. If you do not take intentional authority over your mental imagery, someone or something else will take it for you. The media, social platforms, the remarks you have heard since your youth, the repeated setbacks, all of these compete for the screen of your intellect. The fourth dimension does not inquire if you are a follower or not. It simply reacts to what is projected. For this reason, when the scriptures state in Proverbs chapter 29 verse 18 that where there is no vision, the people perish, it is not discussing a lack of data, but a lack of accurate portraits. An individual can attend a congregation for years and still suffer internal ruin because they never learned to behold differently. If you desire to alter your existence, do not start by altering the world in your proximity. Start by altering the motion picture that plays inside you. Every day, because when the portrait shifts, the dialect shifts. And when the dialect shifts, the Holy Spirit begins to act in a profound, quiet, and unavoidable manner. The fourth dimension initiates precisely there, in the imperceptible place where no one observes, but everything commences its creation. There was a juncture in my path when I had to confront an uncomfortable reality. I was petitioning the divine for things I could not perceive. My petitions were accurate. My remarks were scriptural, but inside me there was no ownership, only a distant longing. And it was then that I grasped one of the most potent regulations of the fourth dimension. What you do not perceive, you do not possess. And what you perceive with transparency, sooner or later, begins to belong to you. When the divine communicated with Abraham, he did not deliver a complex theological lecture. He did not hand over a treaty on belief. He gave a direct and profound instruction. Lift up your eyes and look. The divine understood that as long as the assurance remained only in the ear, it could be disputed. But when it entered through the eyes and was processed by the capacity for imagery, it would become an internal reality. Abraham was elderly. Sarah was advanced in years. Everything in the surroundings shouted impossibility. And perhaps you're experiencing exactly that right now. You look at your physical frame and see restrictions. You look at your age and see a lag. You look at your history and see accumulated blunders. And without realizing it, you begin to accept this as your identity. But the divine did not ask Abraham how he felt. The divine asked what he beheld, because beholding is a spiritual act. On that night, when Abraham exited the tent and began to look toward the firmament, something occurred within him. Initially, he perceived stars, specks of light, something distant. But the more he looked, the more those stars ceased to be celestial bodies and began to become countenances, futures, lineage, and persistence. That ceased to be an external assurance and became an internal experience. He took those portraits to his rest. He took them to his aspirations. He took them to his subconscious. And there, in the fourth dimension, something began to move. Let me ask you something that almost no one enjoys answering. When you lower your eyelids today, what appears first? A viable future or a heavy past? A resolution or a catalog of complications? Because the majority of individuals exist looking backward and then wonder why they do not progress. And this is not a new phenomenon. The spouse of Lot was not penalized merely for a physical movement of the neck. She was immobilized because her heart still pertained to what was left behind. When she looked, that ancient portrait reoccupied her intellect. The fourth dimension does not tolerate fragmentation. Either you progress with the accurate perception, or you become fossilized in the past. Many people petition saying, "Divine One, alter my existence," but continue looking towards Sodom every day, toward the trauma, toward the blunder, toward the disappointment, toward what they forfeited, and then they do not comprehend why they feel obstructed, parched, and hardened within. The physical frame merely accompanies what the intellect has already settled. Abraham did the reverse. He began to look forward, even when the frame said no. And this is something that alarms people. They say, "But is that not dismissing reality?" No, that is subordinating the visible reality to a superior reality. The fourth dimension governs the third, not the other way around. Today, modern discovery confirms something remarkable. Individuals who engage in distinct and repeated visualization activate the same regions in the brain used in the actual experience. The physical frame begins to react to it as if it were already taking place. Biochemicals shift, carriage shifts, choices shift, and then, from the exterior, it looks like a marvel. But on the interior, it was a process. I observed this occur countless times in the calling. Individuals who always perceive themselves as failing continue to fail, even while petitioning. Individuals who always perceive themselves as infirm remained bound to the ailment, even while requesting restoration. Not because the divine did not wish to act, but because the prevailing portrait was still antagonistic to the assurance. Abraham needed to chuckle at his own skepticism before believing. And perhaps you're chuckling within right now. This does not function for me. My situation is distinct. I have attempted everything. But the chuckle of Abraham did not obstruct the divine. It merely unveiled the internal friction that required resolution. And the divine resolved it not with a reprimand, but with a perception. He made Abraham behold so many times for such a duration that the portrait became more factual than his age, more factual than his frame, more factual than the barrenness of Sarah. When that occurred, belief ceased to be a struggle and became a consequence. And here is something that can completely alter the way you exist. What you look at repeatedly begins to rule you. If you rise looking at complications, they expand. If you rest looking at assurances, they establish roots. The fourth dimension is triggered by constant focus. For this reason, the divine did not tell Abraham to look once. He told him to look in every orientation. North, south, east, west. Satiate the eyes. Satiate the intellect. Satiate the interior. Because when the perception becomes complete, dread loses its territory. If today you feel that your belief is fragile, perhaps it is not a lack of petition. Perhaps it is a surplus of incorrect portraits. And as long as you continue looking at the restriction will continue looking back at you. The major inquiry is not if the divine can accomplish it. The inquiry is, can you behold it before you touch it? Because in the fourth dimension, that which is perceived with transparency has already begun to be possessed for a long duration. I notice something that almost no one likes to concede. Individuals are not ruined only by what they experience, but by the manner in which they perceive what they experience. Two individuals go through the same situation. One is transformed, the other is shattered. The discrepancy is not in the complication. It is in the portrait each one constructs within themselves. I observe this occur clearly when a woman enter my study completely fragmented. Her household was in shambles. Her spouse could no longer tolerate being at home. Her offspring were overwhelmed by disgrace. And her daughter existed in a life that, to the eyes of any observer, seemed beyond recovery. Desecration, desertion, debasement. That mother petitioned, wept, and refrained from nourishment. From exterior, it looked like belief. But inside her, there was only one portrait, the portrait of the lost daughter. And here is something that needs to be stated with great integrity. You can love someone profoundly and yet be partnering with the ruin of that person because of the portrait you carry. That mother presented to the divine, day after day, the same mental sequence, the same narrative, the same designation. Without realizing it, she was reinforcing the very thing she desired to see changed. When I looked at her, I did not see a lack of belief. I saw a lack of accurate perception, and I said something that pained her at the start, but liberated her afterward. The divine does not respond to petitions that carry incorrect portraits, not because he is heartless, but because the Holy Spirit only functions fully when he finds a canvas where he can move. She resisted, as many resist. But this is the factual situation, she would say, and that is precisely where the problem resides. The fourth dimension is not ruled by the visible reality, but by the spiritual reality. If you persist in showing the divine only what is wrong, you restrict the kind of work he can perform through you. So I guided her to another place, not to dismiss the transgression, not to idealize the error, but to shift the vantage point. Instead of looking directly at the daughter, I instructed her to look through the cross, the stained cross, the crimson cross, the cross where the past loses the right to define the future. When that woman lowered her eyelids and shifted the portrait, something shattered within her. For the first time, she did not perceive a desecrated woman. She perceived a restored daughter, purified, cherished, welcomed. And in that instant, before any external shift, the mother was transformed. Her countenance shifted, her carriage shifted, her vocal tone shifted, her petition shifted. This is something the majority of individuals do not grasp. When the internal portrait shifts, the external conduct shifts automatically. The manner of speaking shifts, the gaze shifts, the choices shift, and the people in proximity sense it, even without knowing how to explain it. Months later, that daughter returned to the household. Not because someone coerced her, not because she was pressured, but because at some imperceptible point, the spiritual atmosphere in her proximity had shifted. The household that previously would have shunned her would now welcome her. And when she rang the bell, the first thing she encountered was not condemnation, but a countenance illuminated by affection. This young woman did not return because she heard a lecture. She returned because someone shifted the portrait before attempting to shift the conduct. Today, psychological studies validate something potent. Individuals who are constantly perceived and treated as hopeless cases tend to conduct themselves in accordance with that expectation. Conversely, when someone is perceived as capable of transformation, even in harsh environments, the opportunities for change escalate drastically. The scriptures already knew this. The fourth dimension has always known this. Perhaps you're experiencing something similar: a fractured relationship, a distant offspring, a cooling marriage, or perhaps the complication is you. You look in the mirror and only see errors, setbacks, ancient transgressions, poor choices, and then you wonder why you cannot change. But let me ask you something that might sting, but might save. What is the prevailing portrait you have of yourself when no one is observing? Because as long as you continue to perceive yourself as a victim of defeat, you will petition as one who is defeated. You will act as one who is defeated. You will expect little and receive little, not because the divine is restricted, but because the incorrect portrait obstructs the collaboration of the fourth dimension. When the portrait shifts, the existence follows. When the perception is restored, the destiny finds room to manifest. And frequently, the marvel does not initiate in the person we desire to change. It initiates in the one who learns to behold differently. There was a day when I understood, in a profound and irreversible manner, that remarks are not just sounds and thoughts are not just fleeting ideas. They can be the boundary that separates life from passing. And I did not learn this from a volume. I learned it in an infirmary room, before a frame that, according to the medical field, had no further expectation of life. It was the night before Christmas. I was preparing a message when I received a pressing communication. A man from my congregation had been struck by a vehicle. He did not receive immediate aid. He spent hours being moved from one place to another. When he finally arrived at the infirmary, the condition was desperate. Widespread contamination, the onset of lockjaw, internal systems ruined. The practitioners were explicit. Clinically, there was nothing to be done. When I arrived at the infirmary, he was in a profound state of unconsciousness. The atmosphere was weighted. Practitioners were weary. Attendants were cynical. That heavy atmosphere that usually attends the word end. I knelt beside the cot and offered a simple petition, almost too bold for some. I requested only a few minutes. I did not request an instant marvel. I requested time to shift something imperceptible. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he articulated was, "Leader, I am passing away." And there lay the problem. It was not merely the state of the frame. It was the prevailing portrait in his intellect. As long as that phrase existed within him, any petition would be thwarted. So I was direct, perhaps even stern. I told him that if he persisted in saying that, he would pass. Not by divine retribution, but because the portrait of death was already occupying his fourth dimension. Then I did something many would term irrational. I did not debate symptoms. I did not contest medical findings. I began to describe another existence, another scene, another future. I spoke of a healthy man, esteemed, cherished by his spouse, industrious at work, returning to his home with delight. I requested that he behold it, not that he comprehend it, that he behold it. At the start, he wavered, as most individuals waver when the agony is too great. But gradually something shifted. The respiration shifted. The vocal tone shifted. He began to state, "I behold it." And at that moment, something imperceptible occurred. The dialect shifted. He ceased to speak the dialect of passing and began to speak the dialect of the Holy Spirit. While I petitioned, the environment shifted. Attendants began to remark on the warmth, even on a cold day. The practitioner observed without comprehension. The cot began to vibrate slightly. It was not collective sentiment. It was something that surpassed simple explanations. The fourth dimension had been triggered because it finally found a portrait where it could function. 1 week later, that man exited the infirmary on his own feet. Now, let me tell you something with all possible spiritual accountability. This did not occur because I am exceptional. It occurred because the regulation was being applied. The same regulation that acts when someone surrenders to dread. The same regulation that ruins individuals every day when they repeat, visualize, and sustain scenarios of defeat. The discrepancy is that in that room, someone decided to shift the portrait before it was too late. Today, scientific investigations show that patients who maintain internal portraits of recovery, intent, and persistence of life have better biological responses, lower levels of tension, and greater capacity to react to treatments. Discovery is only beginning to touch the edge of something the spiritual world has known for a vast duration. Perhaps you have never been in an infirmary on the verge of passing, but perhaps you're passing away within, passing away in aspirations, passing away in expectations, passing away gradually because every day you repeat phrases like, "There is no way," "It is of no use," "This is not for me." And let me ask you something that can shift everything. If your remarks had immediate creative potency, would you have the courage to state today what you usually state about your existence? Because in the fourth dimension, remarks construct portraits. Portraits mold belief, and belief determines how far the Holy Spirit can act. On that day, in that room, I saw the end retreat, not because it was disregarded, but because it lost authority over the portrait. And when the portrait shifts, even the impossible begins to yield. Perhaps today is not the night before Christmas for you. but it can be the exact day when you decide to stop declaring the end and begin at last to behold a fresh initiation. Before you depart, I want a single truth to remain engraved within you, more potent than any phrase you have heard until now. Nothing alters permanently on the exterior until something alters first on the interior. The fourth dimension does not initiate in the circumstances. It initiates in the portraits you permit to dwell in your intellect every day. You may have belief, you may have scriptural knowledge, you may have good aims, but if you continue to sustain portraits of dread, defeat, and restriction, you will be speaking a dialect that the Holy Spirit cannot utilize fully. When the perception shifts, the dialect shifts. And when the dialect shifts, reality begins to restructure itself. Perhaps you do not yet behold visible outcomes, and that is perfectly fine. Creation always initiates in the imperceptible. The seed expands beneath the soil before it breaches the surface. What truly matters is that, from this moment forward, you become mindful of what you behold, what you visualize, and what you declare. This is how one ascends step by step in sagacity, not with haste, but with orientation. On the screen, the following video is appearing. It is not merely a sequel. It is a further level, another step in this journey of becoming someone a bit superior, a bit more mindful, a bit more synchronized with the truth, 1% better than you are right now. I am grateful for your journeying with me this far, and I await you in the following video. Would you like me to create a summary of the core principles of the fourth dimension mentioned in this text to help you visualize them more clearly?